As Casefile continues into its 10th year, we're currently taking a very short break from new episodes. Brand new cases will be returning on May 23 for premium subscribers and May 30 for the regular feed. But in the meantime, we're continuing our special bonus series, Casefile Archives, a collection of releases revisiting the earliest years of the show, along with previously unreleased premium episodes. Rest assured that these are additional bonus releases and will not replace our standard schedule. We will still be delivering the same number of new episodes this year as we did last year. Casefile Archives is simply a way to mark the 10th year, revisit some older episodes, and share stories that newer listeners may not have heard before. Today's re-release is Ben McDaniel, originally released as a premium subscriber episode in October last year, now available to all listeners as part of our Casefile Archives series. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If you feel at any time you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. For suggested phone numbers for confidential support and for a more detailed list of content warnings, please see the show notes for this episode on your app or on our website. Ask any experienced scuba diver what they think about cave diving and you'll get a different response. For some, the very thought fills them with dread and fear. For others, it's a source of great excitement, providing an opportunity to explore parts of the world that very few people have ever seen. Cave diving is an extreme form of technical scuba diving that allows skilled divers to explore submerged caves that are beyond the reach of natural light. It's been compared to swimming through the history of the planet, with some saying it is the closest environment to outer space. It is a highly challenging and dangerous activity, and as such, individuals must undergo rigorous training and tests before they can receive their cave diving certification. Experienced cave divers often speak about how addictive the sport can be. In addition to the sense of exploration and adventure that cave diving brings, many also find it to have a meditative quality. Down beneath the dark depths of the water, there is no sense of time or the outside world. All that matters is what's happening in the cave at that exact moment. Break your focus, and one mistake can prove fatal. Caves can collapse, stirred up silt can be blinding, diving lines can be cut, and you can easily become disoriented and lose your sense of direction. Some passages are so narrow that divers have become stuck or snagged on rocks. Stay down there too long, and you risk running out of air. Vortex Spring is a commercially operated dive park located just outside the town of Ponce de Leon in northern Florida. It is the largest diving facility in the state, providing a cold, freshwater spring that gently produces a constant outflow at a temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius all year round. Most people who visit Vortex Spring do so recreationally, staying in the campground or coming for the day to swim, snorkel, kayak, or go tubing in the clear waters of the runoff and creek. The basin of the spring itself is a mecca for scuba divers of all skill levels. At 250 feet wide and roughly 58 feet deep, the water is crystal clear with perfect visibility. There are underwater platforms for training and small man-made caverns and crevices to explore. The basin is surface lit during the day and filled with an array of fish and eels tame enough to eat out of your hand. It's an ideal destination for those looking to gain or advance their scuba diving qualifications. For the more adventurous and adequately qualified, 58 feet beneath the surface is the mouth of a cave. Entrance is not for the inexperienced or faint of heart, with 13 people having lost their lives there in the early days of its discovery. Improved safety measures and stricter guidelines led to the installation of a safety gate, the key to which is only given to qualified cave divers after they show their certifications and pay a fee to the dive shop employees. But the area is still fraught with dangers. A sign at the most treacherous part of the cave system features a picture of the Grim Reaper, along with the bold warning: "Stop, prevent your death, go no farther." More than 300 divers, including open water scuba instructors, have died in caves just like this one. Without cave training and cave equipment, divers can die here. It can happen to you. Do not go beyond this point. There's nothing in this cave worth dying for. "30-year-old Ben McDaniel fell in love with water at a young age. Having grown up on a 5.8-acre estate in the suburb of Collierville near Memphis, Tennessee, he'd always gravitated towards outdoor activities, including deep-sea fishing and rock climbing. After he went scuba diving for the first time at age 15 during a family holiday to Disney's Epcot Center, he couldn't wait to do it again. He started practicing in his family's swimming pool by testing out different air tanks. It was a hobby that Ben continued to dabble in over the years, in between completing a degree in construction management at the University of Memphis and starting his own company, McDaniel Construction. After experiencing a series of unfortunate events in his personal life, Ben developed a particular interest in cave diving. He was certified as an open water diver, which allowed him to dive in open, unconfined waters. To get his cave diving certification, he needed to undergo around 2 months of training and log 125 dives with a certified cave diving instructor. Never one to shy away from a challenge, Ben started learning all he could about cave diving by reading technical books about the sport. 2010 had been a rough year for Ben. Thinking some sunshine and time in the water would do him good, his parents suggested he take a year off to clear his head, offering to fund the break. The McDaniels owned a condo in Santa Rosa Beach, a seaside community in the Florida Panhandle, so they suggested Ben go and spend a few months there. Grateful for the opportunity, Ben took his beloved chocolate Labrador, Spooner, and headed to Florida. Less than an hour's drive from Santa Rosa Beach was Vortex Spring. Ben began spending as much time there as he could, paying the entry cost of $25 per day and clocking up scuba diving hours in the hopes of becoming an instructor. He developed a fascination with the underwater cave system and started taking classes and making his own detailed map of the area in the hopes of exploring it himself. The Vortex Spring cave system is somewhat complex. From the surface of the water, the basin itself extends to a depth of around 58 feet. At this point, there is a large cavern which has an opening about 9 feet by 12 feet wide. Go down 115 feet further and you'll find a chamber known as the piano room. This is the entrance point to the underwater cave system, and it is blocked by a reinforced steel gate. Only divers with cave diving certification are allowed to enter, and with good reason. Beyond the gate is one long, narrow, tube-like cave. According to the mapped area, it runs for a further 1,642 horizontal feet, roughly the length of 5 American football fields. with a few small holes jutting off to either side that divers can explore. The terrain consists of cramped limestone passageways with a sandy, silty bottom. It is not for the claustrophobic. Along the way are 4 restrictions. These are the parts of the cave that are so narrow 2 divers can't fit side by side. To get through, divers need to travel in single file, twisting their bodies and equipment to squeeze their way in. During certain points, water from the spring flows outward, adding an extra challenge for divers as they work their way against the current in spaces barely tall enough to accommodate both them and their gear. At the 4th restriction, the passage is only around 10 inches tall and 3 feet wide, marking the narrowest point of the cave. Some have compared traversing it to trying to crawl under a car while in full scuba gear. Venturing further requires divers wearing back-mounted gear to remove their equipment completely, holding their tanks by their sides while maneuvering their bodies as their stomachs drag through the sand and their backs scrape against the limestone ceiling. Back in 2010, only a handful of divers had made it this far. Where the cave led beyond the 4th restriction was not known. The only way out of the cave is via the same entry gate in the piano room. Proper technique dictates that divers should lay lines by mounting nylon rope throughout the cave as they go. This helps them find their way out if they become disoriented or lose visibility due to factors like stirred-up silt or malfunctioning light. However, some inexperienced and reckless divers forego this step and rely on a long pipe that lies along the floor of the cave, which was installed for the purpose of dredging sand. Either way, entering the cave is dangerous and should only be done by qualified, experienced divers who fully understand the risks. Exploring the cave requires knowledge of particular techniques, adequate equipment, and the company of a dive buddy who could help if things went awry. Ben McDaniel quickly became a familiar face around Vortex Spring, often arriving early in the morning before the summer crowds and staying for the entire day. He did multiple dives each day, including in the evenings. Therefore, dive shop employee Eduardo Terran thought nothing of it when he noticed Ben's GMC pickup truck sitting in the parking lot of the dive shop 2 days in a row, starting from Wednesday, August 18, 2010. But when the truck was still there in the exact same place on Friday, August 20, Eduardo began to worry. Eduardo had last seen Ben at around 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening. He and one of his co-workers, a man named Chuck Cronin, had been finishing a dive when they passed Ben as he descended into the piano room. He was wearing 2 side-mounted air tanks, which Eduardo had filled for him earlier, as well as his diving helmet with the light switched on. While all of this was standard gear for a cave diver, the problem was that Ben didn't have his cave diving certification. He only had his open water certificate, an entry-level qualification that meant he was only allowed to dive in areas exposed to the sky to a maximum depth of 100 feet. Although Ben didn't have a diving buddy or the adequate certification to enter the cave, Eduardo suspected that he had been bypassing the gate in the piano room regardless. He'd recently noticed that someone had been tampering with the lock on the gate, and he suspected that person was Ben. Not only had Ben developed a reputation around Vortex Spring as being somewhat arrogant about his diving abilities, he was also often one of the last to leave for the day. Eduardo presumed the reason Ben had been staying so late was so he could bypass the gate without anyone noticing. With this in mind, Eduardo unlocked the gate on Ben's behalf. He reasoned that Ben was going to get past the gate anyway, so he might as well save him a few minutes of air, which could prove precious if he was attempting a long dive on his own. Eduardo and Chuck then resurfaced and decompressed, assuming Ben wouldn't be far behind them. While Eduardo typically waited around for the last diver to resurface each day, he was distracted when a family approached requesting help locating a lost diving light. After helping them for a while, Eduardo and Chuck left for the evening. The next day, Eduardo had some personal matters to attend to and didn't give any more thought to Ben. But when he noticed Ben's truck still in the exact same parking spot 2 days later, Eduardo wondered, what if Ben had never made it back to the surface on Wednesday night? Eduardo asked the other dive shop employees if anyone had seen Ben McDaniel since Wednesday evening. Nobody had. He then notified the Holmes County Sheriff's Department about his concerns before diving into the spring himself to conduct a cursory search. The gate to the cave was open in the exact same position that Eduardo left it 2 days earlier, and one of Ben's spare air tanks was resting against it. There was no sign of Ben himself. Officers quickly arrived at Vortex Spring to assess the situation. In Ben's truck, they found his cell phone and wallet, which contained his driver's license and around $1,100 in cash. A check of the Santa Rosa Beach condo revealed Ben's dog Spooner was there, alone and hungry, like he hadn't been fed in some time. With these discoveries, the officers immediately shared Eduardo's concern that Ben might not have made it back to the surface on Wednesday evening. If that was the case, there was no chance he was still alive. Either he'd died as the result of some kind of accident or medical emergency, or he'd become trapped in the cave and would have run out of air by now. They quickly realized this wasn't going to be a rescue, but a recovery mission. The problem was, the police didn't have the necessary resources to check the full length of the cave. A mission like this required highly skilled and qualified cave divers, preferably ones familiar with the area, and such individuals were not easy to come by. The police enlisted the help of Jeff Laughlin, a rescue diver with over 30 years' experience. Jeff was tasked with putting together a team and coordinating the search. He sourced a group of divers from local dive shops whom he believed to be among the best in the world. Many of them knew Vortex Spring well and were aware of just how dangerous it could be beyond the gate. In their experience, it was just as difficult to get into the cave system as it was to get out. If they did find Ben's body in the cave, recovering it would endanger their own lives as they squeezed through the tight passageways while also pulling Ben's body behind. The divers were split into 3 teams, with each taking turns descending into the spring. In addition to looking for Ben's body, they were searching for his diving equipment. If Ben had intended to explore the caves, they expected to find some air tanks along the way. It was standard practice for cave divers to leave spare tanks as they went to ensure they had plenty of air available on their way out. In the basin, the search teams found 2 of Ben's air tanks secured to the talk box, a box-shaped device that divers stick their heads into to speak to one another while underwater. In the piano room at the entrance of the cave, they found the 3rd tank belonging to Ben that Eduardo had spotted earlier. There was no sign of Ben anywhere in the basin, the cavern, or the piano room. This just left the cave system. Each of the dive teams was tasked with going a little further into the cave than the last. As they made their way down the long, narrow tunnels in single file, they shone torches in every nook and cranny on the lookout for dive gear such as masks, lights, or fins. Recovery of these items could be an indication that Ben had drowned. The further into the cave they went, the thicker the water became with clay, sand, and silt, making it nearly impossible to see. They followed the cave towards the fourth restriction. At certain points, it was so tight that the divers had to hold their air tanks by their sides and swim with one hand extended in front of their bodies. They looked for any telltale signs that Ben had been there, such as scrape marks in the ceilings or marks in the clay from where he'd squeezed his way through. They found nothing. Nor was there any increased activity from scavengers to suggest the deceased body was in the vicinity. Eventually, they reached a point of the cave so narrow and cramped that it was too dangerous for them to go any further. In the view of the rescue team, there was no way someone as inexperienced as Ben could have ventured that far. But if Ben wasn't in the basin, the cavern, or the cave, then where was he? Ben's parents, Shelby and Patty McDaniel, were at their home in Collierville, 430 miles northwest of Vortex Spring, when an officer pulled into their driveway to inform them that Ben was missing. The McDaniels couldn't believe what they were hearing. This wasn't the first time they'd been dealt an inconceivable blow. Just 2 years earlier, in September 2008, Ben had gone to pick up his younger brother, 22-year-old Paul, so they could attend a festival together in Memphis. Ben arrived to find Paul unconscious on his bed, still breathing but unresponsive. Paul was rushed to hospital where he was declared brain dead from what the McDaniel family reported to be a stroke. Ben was devastated by the loss of his younger brother. Together with another sibling, he co-founded the Paul Andrew McDaniel Foundation, which aimed to honour Paul's memory by providing stroke awareness programs and raising money towards stroke education, prevention, and treatment. The only solace for the McDaniel family was that Paul was able to donate his organs, saving at least 4 lives while helping 80 others through tissue donations. The McDaniels were even given the chance to hold a stethoscope to the chest of the man who received Paul's heart, so they could listen to his heartbeat. Shocked to find themselves facing another tragedy so soon, Shelby and Patty McDaniel rushed to Vortex Spring, along with Ben's girlfriend, Emily, who had been dating Ben for the past year. By the time they arrived, the area had been cordoned off. Police officers and cadaver dogs scoured the spring's banks, while divers continued their underwater search. Ben's parents paced, watching anxiously every time bubbles appeared on the water's surface, in case someone emerged with news. One of the cadaver dogs detected decomposition along the banks, while another reacted to a scent in the water, diving in. While this was initially strong evidence that Ben was somewhere under the surface, every time one of the rescue divers reappeared, the answer was always the same. Ben was nowhere to be found. The fruitless search continued for days. On Monday, August 23, there was renewed hope when a revered diver by the name of Ed Sorensen arrived at the scene. Ed owned a dive shop around an hour's drive from Vortex Spring and was one of the most experienced cave divers in the area. Typically the first person called upon for cave rescues in the area, Ed had been holidaying in the Bahamas when Ben McDaniel went missing. He'd spent the last couple of days fielding messages from other divers involved in the search. Each said something similar. The cave was extremely dangerous, and there was no way that an amateur diver without adequate training could have made it any further than the searchers did. Cave diving officials even warned Ed against making the dive, saying the risk was simply too high. Undeterred and determined to make it further than the divers before him, Ed Sorensen headed out to Vortex Spring as soon as he was able. Hopes were high as he suited up and disappeared into the basin. To preserve his air, Ed used an underwater scooter that allowed him to maneuver through the tunnel at a quicker pace. It wasn't long before the tunnel became too narrow and he had to abandon the scooter. Ed continued solo down the tiny passageways, some of which were so tight that he had his stomach in the sand and his back to the ceiling. Burrowing deeper, he had to turn his head sideways just to squeeze through. At 6 feet tall and 190 pounds, Ed was only slightly smaller than Ben, who was 6'1" and 210 pounds. Ed was also highly experienced, having completed around 2,500 dives, whereas Ben was only just starting out. This meant that Ed not only had the skills, but the physical ability to reach places Ben could not. Ed followed the map to its furthest point, then went about 200 feet beyond that. He noticed some marks on the cave where one of the other rescue divers had traversed earlier. He slowly inched about 20 feet further, marking the furthest point searched in the recovery mission so far. This would later become known as the end of the line, described as a 6-inch wide vertical crack. The area was pristine. There wasn't a single mark or clue to indicate that another diver had ever been there before. The next day, Ed Sorensen went into the cave for the second time. He brought a smaller air tank with him, holding it under his arms to make himself flatter. By the time he reached the end of the line, the outcome was the same. There was no sign that Ben McDaniel was down there. Ed dismissed the possibility that Ben could have made it beyond that point. The crack was only around 6 inches wide, making it virtually impossible for a person to get through. Panicking cave divers have been known to burrow into tiny spaces they couldn't normally fit into, but Ed examined the crack and it didn't appear to open up to another room. If Ben had somehow managed to squeeze his way through in a moment of panic, there was no way he could have made it out again. Ed was flabbergasted. By this point, 6 days had passed since Ben was last spotted going down into the water. If his body was down there, fish and other scavengers would be drawn to the scent and rush to the area. Some birds of prey might even be able to detect the scent and circle overhead. With nothing of the sort occurring, Ed studied the map that Ben had been drawing of the cave system. He realized that it didn't even match what was down there. Ed spoke to officers from the sheriff's department to give them his recommendation. As far as Ed was concerned, Ben McDaniel wasn't in Vortex Spring and had likely never gone very far into the cave. He told the police it was time they started looking into other possibilities. The reality was, the past couple of years had been difficult for Ben McDaniel in more ways than one. Not only was he still reeling from losing his younger brother, he was also recovering from a messy divorce. In early 2009, Ben had only been married for a year and a half when he and his wife went their separate ways. Their divorce petition cited disputes and irreconcilable differences. Ben lost his house and had to move back in with his parents. His construction business also began to fail, adding further strain to his financial instability. He left some jobs incomplete, tarnishing his professional reputation. Several years earlier, Ben had inherited a house from his grandfather. He took out a $200,000 mortgage on the property, which friends said he had basically been living off ever since. By the time he moved to Florida, he owed the Internal Revenue Service $48,861 in unpaid federal taxes, as well as $1,177 in state taxes. Eager to turn his financial situation around, Ben enrolled in a course with a non-accredited vocational school called Nouveau Riche, which specialized in real estate investment. The course focused on how to make money flipping houses by using the equity from one home to buy another. Ben continued to dabble in real estate during his time in Florida, launching a company called Rogue Wave Properties. It later turned out that Nouveau Riche was essentially a multi-level marketing company, and the school closed down just a couple of months after Ben's disappearance. Those who knew Ben described him as charismatic and determined. He had a close-knit family and was well loved by many, with one of his ex-girlfriends describing him as one of the most amazing people I've ever met and probably will ever meet. But his back-to-back hardships took a toll, and Ben's mental health suffered as a result. Speculation began that Ben McDaniel might not have accidentally drowned, but gone down into the cave knowing full well that he wouldn't be able to make it out alive. Some pointed at the discarded air tanks as potential evidence of this theory. While open water scuba divers require tanks filled with a combination of compressed air and nitrogen, cave divers require a mix of air, nitrogen, and helium. This is because the deeper a diver goes, the higher the pressure becomes, thus increasing the partial pressure of each gas in the mixture. An increase of nitrogen can have an effect on the brain that is similar to alcohol, impairing the coordination, judgment, and decision-making process of the diver. Helium is added to reduce this effect, while also making it easier and more efficient to breathe at extreme depths. Without it, if the diver does manage to find their way out of the cave and back to land, they will experience what's commonly known as the bends, a medical condition in which bubbles form in the body's tissues due to a rapid reduction in pressure. The bends can lead to tissue and organ damage, resulting in joint and muscle pain, fatigue, numbness, dizziness, paralysis, and at its most severe, even death. While Ben's tank at the entrance of the cave contained a suitable mix of gases for cave diving, the other two tanks found propped up against the talk box did not. For the members of the diving community who were anxiously following the case, this detail was particularly curious, especially because Ben's family insisted that he was well educated when it came to dive theory. Ben's girlfriend Emily had visited him the week before he left for Florida and noted that his bed was covered in technical books about diving, which were filled with highlighted passages and handwritten notes. But if Ben knew anything about cave diving, members of the diving community felt he would have known how important it was to have the proper mix of gases. They also found it strange that Ben left the tanks where he did. Most cave divers typically left them along the path as they went, like a trail of breadcrumbs to use on their way out, whereas Ben had left all of his tanks either out in the basin or at the very start of the tunnel. Furthermore, all scuba diving tanks require a regulator. This is an essential device that reduces the high pressurized air from the tank and converts it into breathable air delivered at ambient pressure. Without one, divers cannot breathe underwater. The tank belonging to Ben found outside of the cave was fitted with a regulator, but the two near the talk box were not. This meant that if Ben had gone into the cave, the only tanks he had to rely on were the ones he was carrying and the one he left at the entrance. If he knew as much about diving as his family claimed, fellow divers believed he would have been aware he didn't have enough air to make it out of the cave alive. He had also broken a fundamental rule of diving: never go alone. One search team member told reporters, diving is a buddy team sport, and that Ben had ignored some basic safety precautions. His dive log indicated he'd been taking classes at a hasty pace, leaving him very little time in between to practice the techniques he was being taught. It also emerged that Ben had been telling people he held diving qualifications that he did not in fact possess. With these suspicious factors stacking up, some started to question whether Ben could have purposely gone as far into the cave as humanly possible, knowing there was no way he'd be able to get out. Perhaps it hadn't been an accident at all, but a carefully planned suicide designed to spare his loved ones the pain of knowing he wanted to end his own life. Ben's loved ones adamantly dismissed this possibility. While Ben had experienced some struggles, they felt that things had been looking up for him. By the time he left for Florida, he was happy in his relationship with Emily and seemed positive about the future. Ben adored his dog Spooner and surely wouldn't have left him hungry and alone inside the condo. He was also incredibly loyal to his family, and they found it inconceivable that he would intentionally put them through the pain of his death. Just days before Ben disappeared, he had written his mother Patty a letter for her birthday in which he expressed how grateful he was for his family's ongoing support. It read in part, "My gift to you this year is my undying love and support. As I have always told you, it is impossible for me to put into words how special you are to me. I thank the Lord each and every day for the awesome blessing of having such great parents. I am so lucky to have you on my team as a friend, confidant, and mum. You are more loved and appreciated than you will know in this lifetime. Thank you again for letting me stay at the condo. It has meant a lot to me and has enabled me to take the time to follow my heart and God's plan for me. I don't know where it's leading me, but you will be the first I will call when I have that aha moment." Ben's parents saw this letter as proof their son had plans for the future and no intention to take his own life. Furthermore, on the afternoon of Monday, August 16, just 2 days before he disappeared, Ben left a friend a voicemail, updating her on how things were going. He sounded like his usual self, talking positively about working on his diving certification and some fun work he'd been doing on a dive boat. Ben said he hoped she was having a good summer before ending the message with, "I miss you and I will talk to you later." Ben's girlfriend Emily dismissed the idea that Ben could have ventured into Vortex Spring on a suicide mission based on his ego alone. She thought he'd be too proud to try and squeeze his way into the furthest most point unless he was convinced he could find his way out. Ben was known to have a go big or go home mentality. Those who knew him didn't see it as suspicious that he'd gone into the cave without proper certification or a diving buddy. Not only was he fearless, but when he found something he was passionate about, he threw himself into it wholeheartedly. An entry in Ben's diving diary confirmed that he had gone into the cave on at least one other occasion. He had written that he needed to figure out a better way to carry his shovel as it kept getting caught. Given that his exploration had seemingly gone well, it was speculated that Ben could have become overly confident and returned to the cave without following the relevant steps. However, to have successfully explored the cave before, he must have known the right mix of gas needed for his air tanks, adding further questions about the discarded ones in the basin. The underwater search for Ben McDaniel continued for 36 days. All up, 16 experienced divers ventured as far into the cave as they felt was viable, but found nothing to confirm Ben had been down there. Officials from the county health department sampled the water around 30 times, testing for an increase in bacteria that would indicate the presence of a decomposing body. They found no trace of any such thing. If Ben had died in the cave, there was a high chance that his undiscovered body would have been pushed out with the gentle flow of the spring's current. Had this happened, his body may have washed out into one of the adjoining creeks. A helicopter conducted an aerial search of the area while mounted police trudged through the surrounding swamp and further downstream. Not a single trace of Ben McDaniel was uncovered. The failed recovery mission left everyone baffled. Although other divers had died in Vortex Spring before, all of their bodies had been successfully recovered. With no sign of Ben or his gear, the search team concluded that if he had drowned, the only place he could be was at the furthest point of the cave, beyond the end of the line, where it wasn't safe for them to venture. If this was the case, it meant Ben had managed to make it further into the cave than some of the most qualified and experienced divers in the world. The case left Captain Harry Hamilton of the Holmes County Sheriff's Department deeply frustrated. While he clarified that the search hadn't officially been called off, he said police were considering other options. He didn't specify what those options were, but the public were already guessing. If Ben's body wasn't in the cave, then he hadn't died by accident or suicide. This prompted people to wonder, what if he had faked his own death? Members of the diving community had been considering this possibility since the early days of the investigation. Something about the way Ben's air tanks were discarded felt off to them, with many believing they had been staged. As information leaked about Ben's financial issues and personal struggles, the theory that he could have staged his own disappearance began to gain traction. Theories ran wild on diving forums and social media. Some posters quipped that Ben would show up on Facebook years down the track, married and using an alias. Others said he was probably kicking back on a tropical island somewhere, eager to leave his troubles behind. But the police had been monitoring Ben's bank, phone, and social media accounts. Not a single one had been touched since the day of his disappearance. There was no evidence to indicate he'd been squirreling away cash or planning for a life on the run. He'd even left a significant amount of money in his wallet, which was found in his pickup truck in the Vortex Spring car park. Various witnesses had seen Ben at Vortex Spring on the day he went missing, but there hadn't been a single confirmed sighting after Eduardo Turan and Chuck Cronin spotted him diving into the basin at around 7 p.m. on Wednesday, August 18. Of all the theories put forward since Ben's disappearance, the possibility that he'd faked his own death was the one his parents shut down the hardest. They found the online speculation highly offensive. Ben had seen how the unexpected death of his brother Paul took an enormous toll on the family. Paddy McDaniel told the Commercial Appeal newspaper, "We know in our hearts that he would have never faked his death to run away. After what we went through with Paul, we know our son well enough to know he wouldn't put us through that again." However, there was another theory they were willing to consider. Vortex Spring was owned by a man named Lowell Kelly. Lowell told the police that on the evening of Wednesday, August 18, 2010, he'd been closing up the dive shop for the night when an unkempt man with wild eyes showed up, asking if it was too late to go for a dive. Lowell thought the man might have been intoxicated, but he explained he was just really tired. Knowing that sleep deprivation is hazardous for scuba divers due to its effect on reaction time and coordination, Lowell said he turned the man away. While he didn't see which way the man went from there, Lowell's reported sighting raised questions about who else could have been in the area on the night that Ben disappeared. What if he'd completed his dive before meeting with foul play? There were also reports that a diver had confronted some teenagers in the area for underage drinking, leading some to speculate that the disgruntled teens might have come back seeking revenge. Police had checked the dive shop's security cameras but found nothing of interest to the investigation, nor were there any signs of a struggle in the area. There was no evidence, such as discarded dive gear, to suggest Ben ever made it out of the water. Then there was the question of motive. Ben's parents said he had no known enemies, and the fact that his wallet still contained $1,100 in cash ruled out robbery. Regardless, they weren't prepared to rule out the possibility of foul play, especially after some shady revelations came to light. On September 1, 2009, just over a year before Ben disappeared, a Ponce de Leon man by the name of Bill Howes had been doing some temp work at the Vortex Spring dive shop when Lowell Kelly said he had a job for him a little further off-site. Lowell drove Bill a few minutes away into a heavily wooded area alongside an alligator pond. Once they got out of the car, Lowell accused Bill of having stolen $30,000 from him. When Bill denied the allegation, Lowell attacked him with a baseball bat, splitting his left ear open while causing lacerations to his left arm and bruises to his arms, side and face. Bill managed to escape, taking off on foot until he reached a sparsely populated dirt road where he was able to call for help. Lowell Kelly was subsequently arrested and charged with second-degree felony assault. He faced court in late October 2010, 2.5 months after Ben McDaniel went missing, and entered a no-contest plea to the charges against him. Lowell was sentenced to 6.5 months community service and 7.5 years probation. Bill was so shaken by the experience that he moved his family out of town for their safety, vowing to never return. Police interviewed Lowell, and while they found absolutely no evidence linking him to Ben McDaniel's disappearance, his assault conviction left tongues wagging among those following the case, including Ben's family. Suspicion also fell on Eduardo Terran and Chuck Cronin, the last two people to see Ben alive. The two friends went diving together almost every Wednesday, just as they had on August 18, 2010. While it was customary for one of the dive shop employees to wait around for the last diver of the day to resurface, this was more of a courtesy than an obligation. Eduardo and Chuck admitted that they'd left for the night knowing full well that Ben McDaniel was still in the water, having become distracted after a family approached when they exited the spring. The family was looking for a lost diving light, and Eduardo had briefly gone down to look for it, forgetting about Ben in the process. He and Chuck had then gone back to Eduardo's place for a coffee, and it was only when Eduardo noticed Ben's truck parked in the same spot on Friday that he realized something was wrong. Both men were subject to a polygraph test and passed, but some felt questions still lingered. At the very least, some thought that Eduardo had acted negligently by unlocking the gate for Ben and not waiting to see if he completed the dive safely. There were further underwater searches for Ben in October and November of 2010, though nothing new was discovered. The McDaniels established a tip line encouraging anyone with information to come forward, but the line stayed silent. The McDaniel family began to believe that Ben had either fallen victim to foul play after resurfacing, or that he'd died in the spring and his body was removed as a cover-up. Unsubstantiated theories were circulating that Vortex Spring employees knew Ben had drowned in the cave before he was reported missing and helped remove his body to avoid bad publicity or a potential lawsuit. Because the police initially believed Ben remained underwater, the area surrounding the Vortex Spring hadn't been properly preserved, and they feared vital evidence that could have helped them find Ben had been lost. As months passed with no breakthroughs, the McDaniels grew desperate for answers. They hired a private investigator who told reporter Cindy Wolf that she was frustrated the authorities weren't aggressively investigating Ben's disappearance as a homicide. As far as the PI was concerned, quote, There is just as much reason to look above the water for Ben's body as there was to look below it. A wastewater operator who tested the water for signs of decomposition supported this statement, telling the Tampa Bay Times, "I hate it for the parents. But to say a man is down there, in my opinion, that's false." For the McDaniel family, one of the hardest aspects of Ben's disappearance was that they couldn't see the cave for themselves. They had no choice but to rely on the word of other divers and to trust what they were being told. At one point, police obtained a special underwater camera, which they sent down into the cave system in the hope it would reach the furthest, still unsearched point of the cave. The McDaniels watched the monitor with bated breath for 8 hours, but the camera cord kept snagging and it didn't make it as far as they'd hoped. They even hired 58-year-old Steve Keane, a highly experienced cave diver who'd led the team that originally mapped the Vortex Spring cave system back in 2003. Steve searched the cave 7 times in the hunt for Ben, going all the way to the end of the line without making any new discoveries. He told the Tampa Bay Times, "We went through the whole cave. If he's in there, I don't know where he'd be." While the McDaniels thoroughly appreciated the search efforts, they couldn't help but feel frustrated by the lack of answers. In the lead-up to what would have been Ben's 31st birthday in April 2011, they announced that they were holding a benefit at their home in Collierville to help raise funds for a reward for information. All up, they raised $10,000. Shelby McDaniel made desperate pleas via social media, announcing the reward and saying, "We need your help. Our son is still missing. We believe Ben died in the springs and his body was removed. We know someone knows something. We are Ben's parents. We must bring him home to bury with his younger brother Paul, who died of a stroke." In another post, Shelby appealed for a fearless diver to search the part of the cave where the other divers had not yet gone in a bid to confirm once and for all whether Ben was down there. This appeal sparked outrage among the scuba diving community. Not only did some people feel it was offensive to the brave divers who had already risked their lives in the search for Ben, they also feared the reward would lure untrained divers into the cave. There was also criticism about the way some of the media had covered the case, with many articles inaccurately referring to Ben as an experienced cave diver. Many members of the scuba diving community wanted it to be known that Ben had acted irresponsibly by venturing into the cave alone without the proper training. Some wished the story would fade from public consciousness entirely, convinced that the whole disappearance was a hoax that only served to tarnish the reputation of a pursuit they deeply loved. They feared that too much negative publicity would result in tougher regulations for those who played by the rules. Worst case scenario, cave diving could be banned completely. With $10,000 up for grabs, divers showed up to Vortex Spring week after week. Members of the scuba diving community voiced their anger on popular scuba diving forums, urging the McDaniels to remove the reward before someone else lost their life. Ed Sorensen told the Jackson County, Florida newspaper, "I understand the family wants closure and I sympathize with them. That's why I do what I do. If there was a 1 in 50 chance that Ben was in there, I would go back. It's not worth dying for something that doesn't exist." Canadian cave diver Jill Heinerth had been following Ben's disappearance since the beginning, drawn in by the mystery of it all. A highly respected diver, Jill had helped recover the bodies of several of her friends who had drowned during underwater explorations, and knew firsthand just how dangerous and unforgiving cave diving could be. Upon hearing about the McDaniels' hunt for a fearless diver, Jill felt compelled to help the family understand that going into the furthest recess of the cave wasn't a matter of bravery, but logistics. She also wanted to make clear to them what search teams were dealing with every time they went looking for Ben. Jill decided to explore the Vortex Spring cave system with her world-renowned diving partner and ex-husband, Paul Heinerth. Paul was not only a highly skilled diver, he also had a keen eye for detail, and Jill felt he would likely notice anything out of place. Jill had since remarried a writer and producer named Robert McClellan. Together, they decided to film the exploration in high definition using a camera with underwater lighting capabilities, not only to prove once and for all whether Ben's body was down there, but also to show the McDaniels exactly what the cave system looked like and how great the efforts made by the search teams had been. By the time Jill and Paul dove into Vortex Spring, almost a year had passed since Ben's disappearance. High-def video camera in hand, they navigated the confined passageways of the cave, capturing stunning and unprecedented footage that showed how extensive the cave system's nooks and crannies were and how limited their range of movement was. By the time Jill reached her limit, they'd found no sign of Ben. All they had found was a small folding shovel with a little bit of rust on it that looked otherwise brand new. While this initially gave Ben's parents hope, it turned out the shovel belonged to searcher Steve Keane. Paul Heinerth was smaller than Ben, and he managed to inch slightly further into the cave than Jill. He got to a point where he was essentially squirming in the sand, with his stomach pinned between the floor and the roof of the cave and his elbows on the walls. At that point, it was physically impossible for him to go any further. In Paul's view, the only way Ben could have made it further into the cave was if he abandoned his diving gear. As none of the gear was found, that didn't seem possible. After the dive, Jill carefully examined the footage for anything they might have missed. Although she saw absolutely no sign of Ben, she wasn't prepared to rule out the possibility that he had gotten into a state of panic and managed to burrow himself even further into the cave than Paul was able to go. She was aware of other cases where something similar had happened. Alternatively, given Ben's recent failures, Jill thought he might have been overzealously determined to make his mark by going further into the cave than anyone else, and paid the ultimate price. Jill Heinerth and her husband Robert McClellan decided to make a documentary about the case titled Ben's Vortex, in which they intended to explore all possible options regarding Ben's fate. Shelby and Patty McDaniel agreed to be part of the project, providing Jill and Robert with exclusive interviews and access to personal information. After spending time with the McDaniels at their home in Collierville and listening to their glowing stories about Ben, his brothers, and their childhood, Robert felt uncomfortable. While the McDaniels were lovely people and gracious hosts who clearly adored their sons, Robert felt they were trying to create an unrealistic image of a perfect family. "I knew there had to be more to Ben McDaniel and the McDaniel family," Robert said. "Nobody is that perfect. No house is that perfect. Their storybook upbringing of their sons was just unbelievable. We wanted to find the real Ben. We wanted to know, who is the real Ben McDaniel?" Jill and Robert ran a background check on Ben and discovered that he had a criminal record that included an arrest for possession of a controlled substance with intent to manufacture, theft of property, assault, and threatening bodily harm, as well as 5 other drug-related charges. None of the charges ever proceeded to trial, and Ben was never convicted on any of them, either pleading guilty to lesser counts or having the charge thrown out entirely. Robert started to suspect that the McDaniels were hiding something after they tried to deter him from interviewing Ben's girlfriend, Emily, who'd been the closest person to Ben at the time of his disappearance. Robert interviewed Emily regardless and discovered something unexpected. The McDaniels had spoken openly with Jill and Robert about the sudden stroke-induced death of their youngest son Paul and the impact it had on Ben. They talked proudly about how Ben was running the Paul McDaniel Foundation to educate others on stroke awareness and how it was his dream to have an office for the foundation in every major city in the country. After some uncomfortable conversations regarding this topic with Emily, Robert discovered that they might not have been telling the full story. Jill and Robert obtained a copy of Paul McDaniel's autopsy report and saw that he hadn't died from a stroke at all, but from a brain injury caused by a drug overdose. The autopsy report concluded that Paul had a history of ADHD, alcoholism, depression, and substance abuse. At the time of his death, there had been toxic levels of opioids and benzodiazepines in his system, drugs that Paul did not have a prescription for. While the true cause of Paul's death, along with Ben's criminal record, didn't provide any further clarity about what happened to Ben, it raised further questions for Robert about the state of Ben's mental health at the time of his disappearance. Robert had personally dealt with addiction and depression in the past while projecting a successful image to the outside world, and he wondered if Ben had more internal struggles than he'd let on. Robert had also worked as a nurse, helping patients who'd experienced addiction and trauma, and he'd seen firsthand how some of them simply chose to leave their lives. He believed it was entirely possible that Ben could have had some kind of psychotic break and decided to reinvent himself. But there might have been a simpler explanation. To be a successful cave diver, one needs to be in optimal physical and mental health. As revealed by the documentary team, Ben had been diagnosed with ADHD, anxiety, and depression, conditions for which he was taking a range of prescription medications, including Adderall, citalopram, and Xanax. Mental health conditions can impact a diver's decision-making process, as well as their ability to think clearly and self-regulate during challenging moments. Furthermore, the side effects of certain medications can mimic symptoms of the bends, such as dizziness, fatigue, and numbness. According to various clinicians, the antidepressants Ben was on increased the risk of having a seizure while underwater. One experienced cave diver and general practitioner who saw Ben's medical history and a list of prescriptions told the documentary team, "If Ben had presented to me as a student, even a simple, basic open water student, there is no way that I would have taught him to dive. There is no way that I would have recommended that he dive, and there is no way that I would have signed a medical saying he was fit to dive." These revelations about Ben's mental health and prescriptions added further weight to the possibility that he'd drowned. Then, in early December 2011, talk of foul play came to prominence again after Vortex Spring owner Lowell Kelly was taken to hospital after being found unconscious in his bathtub. According to a friend, Lowell had attended a party the previous evening, and while being escorted home, he had drunkenly fallen down some stairs and hit his head. This friend said they took Lowell home, helped him shower, and then left him in the bathtub covered with a blanket. The next day, he was unresponsive. Lowell was put on life support but died from his injuries several weeks later. According to a friend of Lowell's, the Holmes County Sheriff's Police Department was being suspiciously quiet about the incident, even to Lowell's family. While police said Lowell's injuries were caused by an accident, others believed Lowell had been attacked or pushed. In March 2012, the long-awaited autopsy report became available to the public. The medical examiner stated that Lowell had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head, but was unable to say exactly how those injuries were sustained. The strange circumstances surrounding Lowell's death, coupled with his criminal history and the fact that he was one of the last people to see Ben McDaniel alive, renewed questions about whether he could have had any involvement in Ben's disappearance. The McDaniels wanted the area surrounding Vortex Spring scoured again for potential clues, and the sheriff's department agreed it was an avenue worth exploring. A team of 13 cadaver dogs was brought in to search for decomposition. They found nothing. The dog handler told the Tampa Bay Times, "I think we've been looking in the right place. I don't think he's in the cave." Around the same time that the Ben's Vortex documentary was in production, television network Investigation Discovery also produced an episode about Ben's case for their true crime program, Disappeared. Ben's parents used the renewed publicity from both productions to increase their reward for information to $30,000. Just days before the episode of Disappeared was scheduled to air in March 2012, 43-year-old US Marine and father of two Larry Higginbotham went cave diving in Vortex Spring and drowned. Once again, Ed Sorensen was part of the recovery team. Larry's body was found near a discarded shovel at one of the furthest restrictions, which was so narrow that nobody could get through. Ed had to recover Larry's body by pushing and pulling him through each of the previous restrictions, risking his own life in the process. Larry's family denied that he had gone down there looking for Ben McDaniel, but other members of the diving community weren't so sure. Some of Larry's cave diving friends claimed that he had been enticed by the increased reward money and had been talking about wanting to claim it. Whatever the case, Ed Sorensen told reporter Cindy Wolf, "Not only did the reward endanger the lives of divers who would risk going farther than they should, it put all of our lives at risk because we would have to go in to recover the bodies." The following month, the McDaniels withdrew the reward, telling Cindy, "We didn't want somebody to go in the cave and drown because they were looking for Ben." It was something they'd discussed in Ben's Vortex too. Shelby McDaniel said he'd regretted his choice of words when calling for a fearless diver, when what he had meant was an advanced diver or something of that nature. With the previous reward going unclaimed and no viable tips submitted to their hotline, they realized that if anyone knew anything about their son's disappearance, they weren't going to talk. By the time Ben's Vortex was released in late 2012, the truth about what happened to Ben remained as elusive as ever. With no sign of Ben's body or diving gear resurfacing after so much time, many divers continued to believe that Ben had either faked his own death or been murdered after resurfacing from the water. Jeff Laughlin, the diver who had coordinated the initial search, said, "The only thing I can say is that everywhere that I knew to look, I looked, but I couldn't find him." Despite the lack of evidence, there were others who believed Ben was still in the cave somewhere. Ben's parents don't know what to think. They had a small granite slab engraved with the words Ben McDaniel, beloved son and brother, and gave it to Eduardo Turan to take down into the cave. Eduardo placed the stone in a spot he thought Ben would like, in a part of the cave he named Ben's Room. In the years since, Vortex Spring has changed ownership. While certain aspects of the cave system have changed and divers are generally discouraged from venturing down there, many continue to do so. For some of them, Ben McDaniel is never far from their minds. Although Ben has never been recovered, his family set up a grave next to his brother Paul's, bearing a suitcase full of mementos and notes written by loved ones. A plaque features Ben's name, his date of birth, and the fact that he was the co-founder of the Paul McDaniel Foundation. It shows 3 photos of a smiling and happy Ben, rock climbing in one and scuba diving in another. Shelby and Patty visit the graves often, cleaning the plaques for their boys and putting in fresh flowers. They also keep a memorial wall for Ben in their home, displaying some of their favourite photos of him. Whatever the truth, much has been said over the years about the risks Ben took by entering the cave without the proper certification, prompting others to risk their lives looking for him. The owner of popular online diving forum scubaboard.com appeared on Ben's Vortex to defend his community, saying, "The scuba community put those limits right out there in front of Ben. Why did he go diving at night? Because he didn't want anyone to see him breaking those limits. Why did he do things the way he did it? Because he wanted to not be caught exceeding those limits. I don't care how you look at this situation, he broke a lot of limits. He broke the law, at least one law, in going through that lock. Did the scuba community fail Ben? Ben failed Ben." Shelby and Paddy disagree with the accusations that Ben acted irresponsibly. They told reporter Cindy Wolf that he lived a life of gusto and adventure, diving into challenges head first without thinking about the dangers. Shelby said, "Ben was brave, Ben was fearless, he followed his passions." Without Ben's body and the answers it would provide, the McDaniels find themselves at a standstill. Speaking to reporter Ben Montgomery while the cadaver dog search was underway in March 2012, Paddy said, "We used to have goals. None of that anymore. You just live day to day. There can't be closure when we don't know anything. Maybe that's our new reality. That there are no answers."